Hello there, and welcome to Sleepy Cosmic Bedtime. Tonight, we ask a question that sounds simple until you actually try to hold it in your mind. How big is the largest star in the universe, really? And the honest answer is that no one has ever fully measured it, because some stars grow so vast that they seem to forget where their own light ends. The way a candle grown impossibly large might lose track of the edge of its own flame, unsure any longer where the fire stops and the room begins. That is the shape of tonight's thought, and there are 4 slow regions we will drift through to reach it. We begin at the home flame, easing back toward the small, familiar star that already warms your skin every day, the one you have never had to imagine because it has simply always been there, patient and close and known. From there we climb the ladder of giants, rising past star after star, each one larger than the one before it, until the ordinary idea of big starts to loosen and slip out of your hands entirely. Then we sink into the soft edge, resting inside the outer layers of a star so wide and so thin at its farthest reaches that it forgets, in its own unhurried way, exactly where it stops, and the dark takes over. And last, we settle with the patient watchers, the long line of humans across centuries who pointed their instruments upward and, one careful measurement at a time, learned to read light that had left its source before any of us were born. 4 regions, one long, unhurried thought, and you do not have to hold on to a single piece of it. You can let all 4 go right now, because I will carry them for you tonight. The way a river carries a leaf downstream without ever asking the leaf to swim. If this kind of drifting helps your eyes grow heavy, a like or a subscribe helps this small channel find its way to other people who are also lying awake somewhere, staring at a ceiling, waiting for something enormous and distant to make their own room feel a little smaller. But that is for later, or for never. It changes nothing about tonight. There is nothing here to hold on to. No names to remember, no plot to follow, nothing you will be asked about tomorrow. Let your shoulders ease down into whatever is beneath them right now. Let your jaw loosen. Let your hands go heavy and open, palms up, asking for nothing. Settle in, low and unhurried, the way starlight settles into a lens after traveling farther and longer than any of us have been alive. Let's begin. Somewhere between waking and the first long breath of sleep, you find yourself here again, at the window, or beneath the blanket that has already begun to feel like the edge of the world, looking out at the dark garden where the stars are kept. You don't have to do anything with what you see. That's the whole arrangement tonight. The glass is cool, or the ceiling is close, or your eyes are already closed and the sky is only the one you remember, and any of these will do. Because the sky doesn't need your eyes open to be there. It has been there the entire time you were folding laundry, answering messages, living the ordinary hours. It waited. It is patient in a way nothing else in your day is required to be. And now, in this hush before sleep, it asks you a single question, so faintly that it barely counts as asking at all. How big is the largest star in the universe, really? Let it sit there a moment, unanswered, the way a good question should be allowed to sit. Not the kind of question with a sharp, clean edge to it, the kind that wants solving before you can rest. This one is rounder than that. It has room in it for not knowing, and for wonder to stretch out inside that not knowing the way you're stretching out now, wherever you are, under whatever weight of blanket has settled over you tonight. Because the honest answer, the one we'll spend this whole night easing toward, is a kind of paradox, soft-edged and strange, Somewhere out there burns a candle so large it forgets where its own light ends. Say that once more, slowly, and let the strangeness of it settle rather than sharpen. A candle, not a wall, not a stone, not a fixed and measurable thing with corners you could run a hand along in the dark to find where it stops. A candle, all flame and glow, so vast that even it seems to lose track of its own boundary, the place where its light stops being the star and starts being simply space, warmed. That not knowing is not a flaw in tonight's story. It is the heart of it. Hold that thread loosely as we go, a candle so large it forgets where its own light ends, and let it reappear now and then like a familiar hand resting on your shoulder, not asking anything of you, just letting you know it's still there, still walking beside you through the dark garden of the sky. There is no hurry in any of this. You could close your eyes right now, and the sky would keep its shape without you. The question would keep waiting, patient as the light that carries it, for as long as it takes you to drift toward the answer, or drift past it entirely into sleep, and either ending would be the right one. That's worth saying plainly. Once, near the beginning, there is no version of tonight where you fail to understand something correctly. No test waiting at the far end of these words. There is only the slow unfolding of a single idea, turned over gently, again and again, until its edges soften and it becomes something closer to a feeling than a fact. But before a mind mid-drowse can feel the size of anything so enormous, it needs something small enough to hold first. A coin before a mountain. A single grain before a shoreline. So tonight, before we go looking for giants, we begin with something you already know, something that has been quietly present in every day of your life without ever once demanding to be noticed. Our own star. The sun, the small, familiar flame that has been rising and setting over every ordinary Tuesday you've ever lived, warming your skin at the beach, slanting gold through a kitchen window at 6 in the evening, so constant that it became invisible the way a heartbeat becomes invisible, always there, never quite attended to. Tonight, we attend to it. Tonight it becomes the ruler against which everything else, all the impossible largeness still to come, will be measured. And there's a kind of relief in that, if you let yourself feel it. You are not being asked to grasp the ungraspable all at once. Nobody is handing you the largest star in the universe and saying, "Here, understand this immediately. Hold its whole unbelievable size in your 2 hands before you sleep." That isn't how tonight works, and it isn't how any of this ever needs to work. You are simply being invited to start small, smaller than small, even smaller than the star you already carry a lifetime of memory around, and let the scale build itself in your body, one unhurried step at a time, the way a staircase is climbed one riser at a time, even when the tower above is tall enough to disappear into cloud. Nothing tonight needs to be held onto. No number needs memorizing. No fact needs filing away for later. You can let each idea arrive, be felt, and drift on, the way a boat is felt passing beneath you on a still lake, and then is simply gone, leaving only the faint rock of the water it left behind. That rocking is enough. That's all any of this needs to leave in you, not information, just a lingering, low, wordless sense of scale, settling into the body like warmth settling into a blanket that's finally been tucked all the way in. Think, for a moment, of every star you've ever looked up and found without trying, the bright, familiar ones that seem to know their own names, the ones low on the horizon in winter, the faint smudge of ones that only appear once your eyes have adjusted long enough to the dark. Every one of them is farther away than feels reasonable, and every one of them is, in its own way, a kind of candle too, burning somewhere out past the edge of what a single glance can measure. Tonight we are not going to visit all of them. We are going to visit only a handful, chosen carefully, each one a little larger than the last, each one a step further out along a ladder that leads, eventually, toward giants so vast that even astronomers, with all their careful instruments, still argue softly over exactly how wide they are. But every ladder needs a first rung low enough to reach from where you're standing. And ours, tonight, is close. It rises every morning. It has been rising your whole life. So let the sky outside your window stay exactly as unhurried as it's always been. The stars aren't going anywhere. They have nowhere else to be. No meeting in the morning. No reason to rush their light toward you any faster than it already, patiently, comes. Some of that light left its source before you were born. Some of it left before your parents were born, journeying alone through the enormous dark for years upon years upon years, aimed, without knowing it, at the exact moment your eyes would happen to be open to receive it. There is something in that thought that asks nothing of you but stillness. A photon that has traveled for decades doesn't need you to understand physics. It only needs you, for one unhurried moment, to look up, or to imagine looking up, and let it finish its impossibly long, faint, patient journey by simply landing, softly, in you. And it is in that spirit, unhurried, undemanding, content to let scale reveal itself slowly rather than all at once, that we turn now toward the sun, not as the star that lights your mornings, but as a kind of instrument, a ruler laid gently across the dark, because to feel what largest could possibly mean, to let the word stop being an abstraction and start being something your body can almost sense, the way you sense the size of a room by how long it takes to cross it, we need a beginning point small enough to hold. We need something we already, quietly, know the shape of. The sun has warmed the back of your neck. It has set behind hills you've stood on. It has a diameter, a distance, a weight of light you have felt without once needing the number for it. And tonight, for the first time, perhaps, we'll let that familiar flame become the first rung on a very long, very gentle ladder, the modest candle beside which every impossible giant still to come will eventually be measured, and against which, oddly, tenderly, even our own small sun will one day seem like the beginning of something far larger than itself. Let your breath slow, if it hasn't already begun to on its own. Let the blanket hold whatever warmth it's gathered. Nothing here is a test, and nothing here is urgent, only a story unfolding at the speed of starlight, which is to say, unfolding exactly as fast as it needs to, and not one moment faster. And so we start where all true measuring starts, not with the largest thing imaginable, but with the smallest true thing we can hold in our hands. Our star, our sun. The first mark on the ruler, waiting, warm and familiar, just on the other side of sleep, and before any candle out there can be called large, or small, or anything at all, you need something to measure it against, a ruler you already carry, without knowing it, every time you feel warmth on your skin. So let the sky settle for a moment on the one flame close enough to touch you. Your own star, the sun. Picture it not as a fact in a textbook, but as a shape you could walk around, if walking across such distances were the kind of thing a body could do. Edge to edge, the Sun measures about 1.39 million kilometers. Lay planet Earth against that width, and you could fit 109 of them, shoulder to shoulder, blue marble touching blue marble. Before you reached the far side, 109 small stones lined up along the rim of one great burning wheel. More of them than you could count on your fingers and toes 10 times over, and still the wheel would not be finished. And light that seems instant, that seems to simply be everywhere the moment it exists, takes a full 8 minutes to travel from that surface to the one falling across your blanket right now. Every beam warming a windowsill this evening left the sun before you'd finished this sentence. It has been 8 minutes underway, patient and unhurried, crossing the same emptiness that Mercury and Venus drift through on their own long, slow circuits. An emptiness so vast that even something moving at the fastest possible speed in the universe still needs the better part of 10 minutes to arrive at your eyelids. Nothing has ever traveled here any faster. Nothing ever will. Hollow the sun out if you like. This is only a thought, nothing more. A drowsy experiment behind closed eyes, and pour Earths into the space inside. 1 million of them. 1 million blue marbles, disappearing one by one into that single sphere of light, tumbling in without ever touching the edges. And still, there would be room left over for a few thousand more, drifting loose in whatever space remained. That is the kind of vastness we are dealing with tonight. Right at the very first rung of the ladder, a star so ordinary, so unremarkable among its siblings, that astronomers rarely even pause to marvel at it. And yet, it could swallow 1 million worlds like the one you are resting on, and barely notice the difference in its weight. The way an ocean does not notice one more drop of rain finding its way home. It's for exactly this reason that astronomers stopped using kilometers at all when they speak of stars, the way you might stop measuring a mountain range in centimeters, or the distance between cities in the length of your own footsteps. The numbers simply grow too large to hold, too many zeros trailing off the edge of the page until they stop meaning anything at all. So they needed something built to the right scale, something a mind could carry to bed with it, without it slipping through the fingers on the way. And so they took the sun itself, its whole 1.39 million kilometers of light and heat, and folded it down into a single portable unit. One solar radius. That's all. A quiet word for an entire star, a unit small enough to write on a page and vast enough to still mean everything it once meant. When you hear, later tonight, of a star measuring 700 solar radii, or 1,000, or 2,000, know that each of those numbers is simply asking one gentle question: how many suns would it take, lined up from center to edge, nose to heel, to reach as far as this one star reaches? The sun becomes the tick mark. The sun becomes the inch, the foot, the single familiar footstep against which every stranger's much longer stride is quietly, patiently compared. And what a steady footstep it has kept. Because size alone doesn't tell you much about a candle if you don't also know how long it has been burning, how faithfully, how evenly it has kept its shape while everything else around it changed. Continents drifting, oceans rising, entire species arriving and passing on beneath it. At the sun's center, in a core compressed and heated past anything your body will ever need to imagine directly, hydrogen has been fusing into helium for 4.5 billion years. 4.5 billion years of the same reaction, the same tender exhale of light, repeating itself far below the surface, unseen, unfelt, simply continuous. A pilot flame that has never once gone out since long before there was an earth to warm, long before there was anyone to lie beneath a blanket and wonder about it, long before there was a blanket at all. In all that time, the sun has neither swollen nor shrunk in any way a lifetime could notice. It holds its shape the way a held breath holds stillness, not because nothing is happening, but because everything happening inside is in such unhurried balance that the outside barely stirs. Gravity pulling inward, fusion pushing outward, the two forces so evenly matched, night after night, year after year, eon after eon, that the result from outside looks almost like rest. A flame that has simply learned, long ago, how to keep its shape. So hold that picture for a moment, because it deserves to be held. 1.39 million kilometers across. 109 Earths in a row. 1 million Earths inside. 8 minutes of travel just to reach your eyelids. 4.5 billion years of unbroken warmth poured out steadily enough to raise oceans, to grow forests, to warm the very blood now moving quietly through you as you listen. This is not a small thing. This is, by any measure a body could reasonably take in, an almost unimaginable furnace of light, and it is only the nearest one, the one we happen to orbit, the one that taught us, patiently, how to count it all. And yet, here is the low, almost impossible turn the night wants to take now. The turn that makes the ladder worth climbing at all, on the shelf where the universe keeps its stars. This one, our whole enormous, generous, 4.5 billion year candle, sits closer to the small end than the large. Not the smallest, nothing so unassuming as that. There are candles out there smaller than a fingertip against a beach, but modest all the same, when set beside what else is out there burning in the dark. Because scattered among the countless other candles turning through the night are stars that would make the sun look, by comparison, like a single struck match held up beside a bonfire, stars so wide that if you set them where the sun now sits, their edges would stretch far past every planet you have ever been able to name from a rooftop, past orbits that take our own world's years, sometimes decades, to complete just once. Some of them swell not twice as wide as the sun, not 10 times, but many hundreds of times wider. A few, further out still, swell to nearly 2,000 times the reach of the very ruler we have just finished building together, tucked now somewhere safe behind your eyes, ready for whatever comes next. It hardly seems possible, does it, lying here, that the same simple rules, gravity pulling in, fusion pushing out, hydrogen becoming helium in some hidden furnace, could produce both the steady, familiar warmth now falling across your skin, and something so much vaster, it barely resembles a star at all anymore, more like a slow burning horizon with no far shore. And yet the rules never change from one star to the next. Only the amount of fuel does. Only the weight pressing down on the core. Only the long, unwritten future each star happens to be born into. The universe rarely stops at one size when it finds a shape it likes. It tends to keep going, unhurried, patient, for as long as the numbers allow, the way a single idea, given enough room, can grow far past whatever first held it. So let the sun settle now in your hands as a unit, as a ruler, as a familiar warmth you can compare everything else against for the rest of the night, whatever shape it takes. There is nothing more to hold on to here than that. One steady candle, well known, well measured, ready to be set beside strangers. And with it settled, the night is ready to leave this first flame behind for a while and drift outward, past the edge of its own light, toward names that may already sound faintly familiar from other evenings spent looking up. Small steps at first, easy ones, brighter points scattered not too far into the dark, before the true climb begins in earnest, toward the giants waiting further out still, patient, wide, and by no means finished growing. So hold that modest flame in mind, the one that took 8 minutes to reach you tonight, because now we can begin to climb, one rung at a time, past candles that were lit long before ours and burn in shapes it will never take. You do not have to follow closely. You only have to drift along beside the numbers as they rise, the way you might watch a staircase disappear upward into a house you already know is safe. The first rung is barely a step at all. Sirius, the brightest point in the whole night sky, is not much larger than our own star, perhaps a rung and a half taller, its light reaching you simply because it sits so near. A neighbor's porch lamp rather than a distant bonfire. Already here the pattern of the night begins. Brightness and size are not the same promise, and you can let go of assuming they are. Higher up, Arcturus opens wider still, a star swollen to some 25 times the width of the sun, its surface cooled to a low amber glow, the kind of orange you might see banked in the last coals of a fire before anyone thinks to add more wood. Near it, Aldebaran, the eye of the bull in old star maps, spreads even further, a soft red giant some 44 suns across, its light unhurried, its color already leaning toward rest. Then the staircase changes character. Rigel, blue, white, and searing, is a different kind of largeness, not old and cooling like the giants around it, but young, massive, burning through its fuel so fast and so hot that it has swelled to some 70 or 80 times the sun's width, while still blazing blue. A candle built thick from the very beginning, rather than one that grew slowly into its own light. It reminds you that size in the sky is never only about age. Some candles are born broad, others widen with the years, the way a fire settles and spreads as its center gives way. And then you reach Betelgeuse, and here the staircase seems to lose its steps entirely and become something closer to a doorway. This is the shoulder of the hunter in the winter sky, a star so wide that if you set it where our sun sits, its surface would reach out past Mars, past the loose scatter of rock and ice we call the asteroid belt, swallowing that whole quiet stretch of space where Earth is not, where nothing of ours has ever needed to be. Estimates place it somewhere between 700 and 900 times the width of the sun, a range wide enough on its own to remind you that even our most careful rulers grow a little uncertain out here, at the top of the ladder. Picture it simply. Light leaving the center of that star would need well over an hour just to reach its own outer edge. A single candle, taking that long to notice its own light. There is no need to hold on to the number itself. Let it pass through you the way a large distance in a dream passes through you, understood, felt, and then released. Because what matters here is not memorizing 700 or 900, but letting the shape of the idea settle, that somewhere above your rooftop tonight burns a single sphere of gas wide enough to have quietly absorbed an entire inner solar system's worth of orbits, and it has done this without violence, without any sound crossing the emptiness to reach you, simply by existing at the scale it exists at. The night sky keeps its true proportions hidden behind such friendly, low points of light and that hiding is itself a kind of mercy. You were never meant to feel the true size of these things pressing on you as you fall asleep, only to know, faintly, that they are there. It is worth pausing here, unhurried, to ask the gentlest question of the night so far. Why? Why would a star grow to such a size at all when it began, like ours, as a comparatively tidy sphere of hydrogen quietly fusing into helium in its core? The answer is patient and almost tender, and it has nothing to do with violence. A star spends most of its life doing one simple thing: burning hydrogen at its center, holding its own weight up against its own gravity with the outward push of that fire. A long and steady balance that can last billions of years, exactly as it does inside the sun right now. But hydrogen at the center is not endless. Slowly, over ages too long for any single lifetime to witness, the core uses up what it has. And when the very center runs low on fuel, the star does not simply dim and fade the way a candle in a room might. Instead, something almost graceful happens. The burning does not stop. It moves. It shifts outward into a widening shell around that spent core, hydrogen still fusing, but now in a ring further out. Like a fire that has eaten through the center of a log and continues along the surrounding bark instead. That shift changes everything about the star's shape. With the furnace no longer concentrated at the center, the outer layers lose some of the tight, steady support that held them close for so long. They are still warmed, still lifted by the star's enormous energy, but the balance loosens, and the whole outer envelope begins to swell outward, expanding the way a slow breath fills a chest, the way dough rises quietly overnight, without anyone needing to watch it happen. As that envelope spreads across a far greater volume, it also cools, because the same warmth is now spread so much more thinly across so much more surface. The blazing white or yellow-white light of a younger, tighter star relaxes into deep orange, then into a low ember red, the color of a fire not going out, but easing back, settling into something wider and quieter than it was before. This is the essence of every red giant and every red supergiant you might ever be told about. Not a star dying in any frightening sense, but a star relaxing, its fire redistributing itself outward the way warmth spreads through a blanket once you stop holding it tight around yourself. In truth, this is a story that can repeat more than once across a single star's long life, each new shell lighting as the one before it exhausts its own reach, hydrogen giving way to helium fusing further in, layer folding softly upon layer like the rings hidden inside a very old tree. Nothing about this needs to feel dramatic. It happens over spans of time so long that a human lifetime could not watch even the smallest fraction of it unfold, and unfolding closer to the drift of a glacier than to anything you would call an event. The star is not struggling. It is simply following the oldest arithmetic there is. Less fuel at the center, more room at the edges, and answering it the only way gravity and light know how to answer: by loosening, by widening, by letting the outer layers drift a little further from home with each passing age. You could think of it, if it helps, as a candle in its later hours, not guttering, not in danger, simply wider than it was when it was first lit, its flame no longer a narrow point, but a soft, spread bloom of light and heat that reaches further into the dark room around it. Betelgeuse is exactly this kind of candle, a red supergiant, a star that has already moved past the tidy hydrogen burning of its youth and into this looser, broader, ember-colored stage, its outer layers so far from its center now that the star itself seems almost to have forgotten its original tighter shape. And it is not alone up here. Antares, glowing red in the heart of the Scorpion, follows the same slow arithmetic, swollen by that same outward moving fire. Another giant candle, relaxing into its wide, warm age. But even Betelgeuse, vast as it is, turns out to be only a landing partway up the staircase, not its final step. It is, in fact, merely a supergiant, one useful rank below the rarest family of all, and the difference between those two words, giant and supergiant, and the still stranger hypergiant waiting above them, is really only ever a difference of how far the swelling has been allowed to go. How many shells have lit? How many ages the star has had to loosen its own grip on itself? Somewhere above Betelgeuse, past what feels already like the edge of reasonable size, the latter keeps climbing into a small, rare family of stars so extreme that astronomers set them apart with their own name, the red hypergiants, the very top rung. Where the numbers stop sounding like distances between planets and start sounding like distances between worlds you have never had reason to imagine standing beside one another at all. You do not need to climb quickly. Let the staircase simply continue upward on its own, past this last comfortable landing, while you rest here a moment longer among candles wide enough to have already reordered your sense of what a single star can be. It is toward that top rung, quietly, that we climb next, toward candles so wide that even Betelgeuse would seem, beside them, like a rung you passed almost without noticing. And so the rungs keep passing beneath us, higher and higher, until the ladder itself seems to run out of names for what it's climbing toward. And we arrive, at last, at the very top, the handful of stars that hold the record, that sit at the far edge of the tape measure astronomers have spent lifetimes stretching across the dark. Here is UY Scuti, somewhere near 1,700 times the width of the Sun. Here is Stephenson 218, swelling past it to something like 2,100 solar radii, one of the largest stars ever measured. And nearby in the ranking floats Vicanus Majoris, a longtime giant among giants, its exact size still debated, but its presence unmistakable, wrapped in a haze of its own shed material like a lantern behind fog. You don't need to hold these names. Let them drift past like distant lights on a shoreline you'll never visit. It's enough to feel their scale pass through you, one candle after another, each larger than the last. To feel what these numbers actually mean, borrow the trick we used with the Sun and set the giant down in its place. Imagine sliding Stephenson 218 into the middle of our own solar system, its center where the Sun now sits, its light still warming the same patch of space. Mercury would vanish first, swallowed almost instantly. Venus next, then this good Earth, then Mars, all of them, one by one, folded inside a single surface before you'd even reached the outer edge of it. The asteroid belt, that thin scatter of rubble between Mars and Jupiter, would lie buried deep within the star's own body, no longer a boundary of anything. And still the surface would keep going, out past Jupiter, that vast planet reduced to a pebble, somewhere in the star's interior, out further still, reaching, straining, until it finally thinned into nothing somewhere in the region where Saturn keeps its rings. One star, one single breathing surface, standing where our whole familiar neighborhood of planets used to be. Picture it a little longer, if you like, without any need to picture it precisely, the old, familiar diagram of our solar system, the one you may have traced with a finger as a child. Planets strung out like beads on invisible string, and now simply one bead grown so large it has quietly absorbed all the others into itself. No collision, no violence in it, nothing crashing or breaking, Only a boundary that used to sit close in, now sitting almost impossibly far out, the way a ripple in a pond keeps widening long after the stone that started it has settled to the bottom. There is nothing to do with a fact like that except let it sit in you like a low hum, warm and enormous and entirely harmless from here, a shape too large for worry to find its edges. And because a shape this vast changes even light's relationship to it, consider what it would mean to cross one. Light, the fastest thing there is, needs only a little over a second to travel from the Earth to the Moon, about 8 minutes to reach us from the Sun's own surface. But to travel from one side of a hypergiant like this to the other, to cross its whole open body, pole to pole, light itself would need hours. Hours for the fastest thing in the universe to travel the width of a single object. Nothing about that needs alarm. It is simply the sound scale makes when it gets large enough, a hush spreading out so far that even light starts to feel unhurried, wandering rather than racing, taking its patient time to cross a room the size of a solar system. If you sat at the very center of such a star and let out a single sigh of light, that sigh would still be traveling outward, still be climbing patiently toward the surface, long after you had let your own eyes fall shut for the night. And only some hours later would it finally reach the edge and slip free into the waiting dark. But before this climb tips over into simple astonishment, it's worth pausing here, gently, to untangle a word we've been using loosely all night: largest. Because largest, on this ladder, means only one particular thing: widest. It means radius, the distance from a star's center out to wherever its light finally slips free. And width, it turns out, is not the same as weight, and it is not the same as brightness, and it is worth feeling the difference, because it changes what kind of giant we're actually standing before. Take a star like R136A1, tucked in a dense stellar nursery in a neighboring galaxy, one of the heaviest stars known, carrying perhaps 200 times the mass of our sun folded into its body, 200 suns worth of matter. And yet, in sheer girth, in the simple question of how far its surface reaches from its center, R136A1 is almost modest, smaller across than our own sun would be if you tried to compare them side by side, and utterly dwarfed by the widths of UY Scuti or Stephenson 218. It is heavy in the way a coiled spring is heavy, dense and compact, and holding enormous mass in a small volume, while the hypergiants are large in almost the opposite way, vast and open and comparatively light for their size, mass spread thin across a staggering distance. Two different kinds of giant, wearing two different kinds of grandeur, and neither one is lesser for it. Picture, if it helps, two very different kinds of largeness resting side by side, one a small, dense stone held tight in a closed fist, heavy for its size, every bit of it pressed close together, the other a great, loose armful of mist, spread wide and open, easy to pass a hand through, weighing far less than its size would ever suggest. Both are real. Both earn their place in the record books, each in its own column, and neither one needs to compete with the other for tonight's attention. The universe, it turns out, has more than one way of being big, and brightness follows its own separate path entirely, indifferent to both size and weight. Some modest little stars, dense and searing hot, blaze with a light per square inch of surface that a cool, sprawling hypergiant could never match, ounce for ounce. A giant like Stephenson 218 shines with tremendous total output simply because it has so much surface to shine from, every one of those countless square kilometers glowing at once, but its light is a low, deep ember red, unhurried and dim compared to the fierce blue-white blaze of a smaller, hotter star, working at far higher temperature. So largest is never one crown resting on one head. It is a whole small constellation of different crowns, width, weight, light, and tonight we are simply visiting the one for width, the widest rooms in the house, leaving the others for some other, later night. It's worth saying, too softly, that even these record numbers are not carved in stone. Every figure you've heard tonight, 1700 solar radii, 2100, the shifting rank of Vicanus Majoris, carries around it a faint halo of uncertainty. A range, rather than a single fixed point. These stars sit unthinkably far away, wrapped in shells of their own dust and gas, their true edges smudged by the very material they've breathed out into space around themselves. Astronomers measure as carefully as light and mathematics allow, and still arrive at answers with a little give in them, a little room to breathe. This one, perhaps 1700, give or take a few hundred. That one, perhaps 2100, though older estimates once placed it larger still, before better instruments and better distances gently pulled the number back down. There is no need to feel unsettled by that give. It's simply an early, honest hint of something the rest of the night will keep returning to, that up here, at the far reaches of size, the edges of things stop being crisp. The ruler itself starts to soften. Think of it less as a mistake and more as an honesty, a scientist's way of saying, plainly, this is as far as our current eyes can see, and we would rather tell you the size of our uncertainty than pretend to a precision we don't have. There is a kind of tenderness in that admission, a willingness to leave a little room around every number, the way you might leave a light on, low in a hallway, rather than claim to know exactly where every shadow falls. Which leaves one last natural question hanging in the dark, and it's the right one to carry forward. If a star can grow wide enough to swallow the orbit of Jupiter and still be reaching for Saturn, if it can stretch across a distance that takes light hours to cross, then surely, you might think, it must be made of an almost unimaginable amount of stuff. Vast walls of material, packed floor to ceiling, dense and heavy the whole way through. And yet the honest answer, when you actually go looking for what fills all that space, turns out to be something far stranger and far gentler than that. The answer is almost nothing. A giant this size is, by weight, mostly empty room. A candle whose flame has grown so enormous that what little wax it has left is spread thin across the whole vast shape of it, more glow than substance, more breath than body. And that is where we go next, drifting into the quiet, hollow heart of these giants, to feel just how little is actually there. So the giant is not made of stone, and it is not made of anything you could hold in your hand. If you could reach through the dark and press your palm to the outer edge of such a star, you would find almost nothing there at all. No crust to feel, no skin to touch, only a breath of gas so thin it makes the air around you tonight, the air resting in your own quiet room, seem dense by comparison. This is the strange secret of the largest stars. Their size has almost nothing to do with how much of them there is. A red hypergiant swollen out to hundreds of times the width of the sun might carry, spread across all that space, only 10 or 20 or perhaps 40 suns worth of matter, a modest sum, breathed outward and outward until it thins to something closer to fog than to flame. Where the sun packs its mass into a tight, bright sphere, the giant has let itself go loose, unclenched, its substance drifting apart the way a held breath finally releases into a cold room and becomes visible only as a soft cloud before dissolving. You are not looking at a solid candle so much as the memory of one, the shape of fire without the density of wax. Picture it this way, since your body already knows what thin air feels like, standing on a high mountain, where each breath draws in less than it would at sea level, where the air still surrounds you completely and holds you and lets you breathe, but asks so much less of the space it occupies. Now imagine that thinning continued, mountain past mountain, altitude past altitude, for hundreds of millions of kilometers, and you begin to sense the outer reaches of a star like this. It is not a wall of fire waiting to be crossed. It is an atmosphere in the truest sense, a long, unhurried fading, matter spread so generously thin across such an unthinkable volume that if you gathered up a single cubic meter of it and set it on a shelf beside a cubic meter of the air in your bedroom tonight, the starlight would lose. Your ordinary air, the air moving in and out of your chest right now, is denser than the outer layers of the largest known stars in the universe. There is something almost tender in that fact. The giant that could swallow the orbit of Mars is, at its very edges, more delicate than a curtain stirring in a window. Think of how much room that leaves for nothing. All the matter of such a star, gathered up and weighed, might total only a few dozen suns, and then, that modest weight is handed the task of filling a sphere so wide that light itself takes hours rather than minutes to cross from one edge to the other. Spread a few dozen suns across a volume that size, and the result is inevitable, mostly emptiness, laced with just enough gas to carry a glow. If the sun's own matter were divided this thinly, you could pass your hand through what used to be its surface and feel almost nothing brush your skin, the faintest suggestion of warmth and pressure where there was once a hard, bright boundary. This is not a flaw in the giant, some failure of its fire. It is simply what happens to matter when it is given far more room than it needs, the way a small amount of scent can fill an entire house if the windows stay closed long enough, present everywhere and dense nowhere, felt before it is ever truly touched. And yet it moves. Even at this thinness, even spread this wide, the star is not still. Nothing this alive ever truly is. Deep within, heat rises from the core in patient, unhurried currents, the way warmth rises from a low fire and stirs the air above it. Except here, the currents are not palm-sized eddies, but convection cells vast enough to be measured against entire stars. A single rising column of gas inside a red hypergiant can be wider than the sun itself, a lazily turning wheel of heat climbing from the depths, cooling as it nears the surface, sinking again, patient and enormous, taking months or years to complete a single unhurried revolution. If you could watch it from a great distance, sped up so a human lifetime became a single held breath, you would see the giant's whole surface seem to simmer, not the frantic bubble of a rolling boil, but something closer to the low heave of a vast, sleepy sea. Swells the size of continents rising and falling as heat makes its long way outward into the dark. Astronomers who study these titans sometimes see this directly. Their brightness dims and brightens. Dims and brightens, not because the star is dying or troubled, but because a handful of these colossal convective cells are turning their bright faces toward us and then away, like a great, drowsy eye opening and closing over centuries. So hold both of these truths together, the way you might hold two ends of the same thread. A star that could contain the orbits of half the solar system, and a star with less substance, cubic meter for cubic meter, than the room around you. This is why the candle metaphor deepens here rather than resolving. A candle, in your mind, is mostly wax, a dense, solid body with a small bright flame perched at its tip, doing the work of light while the wax simply waits beneath it, fuel in reserve. But a red hypergiant has almost let go of its wax altogether. It is mostly glow. It is nearly all flame and hardly any substance, a shape held together less by the honest solidity of matter than by the outward push of light and heat straining ceaselessly against the soft, incomplete pull of gravity. It burns not despite its thinness, but somewhat because of it. Matter spread this wide can only be held loosely, and a star held loosely is a star always on the verge of drifting a little further outward, sighing off another thin skin of itself into the dark around it, the way a candle in its last hour softens at the rim and lets a little more of itself run than it once did. This is, perhaps, the gentlest way to understand something that reports of the largest star in the universe rarely explain: bigness. Out there is not the bigness of a boulder or a mountain or anything you have ever lifted or leaned against. It is the bigness of an exhale. It is what happens when a star, having burned through the tidy hydrogen at its center, no longer needs to hold itself so tightly, and so it simply widens, unclenching outward the way your own shoulders unclench when a long day finally ends, the way a held stillness finally releases into something looser and wider and easier. The giant is not more star than the sun. In a sense, it is less star, less concentrated, less dense, less defined, and somehow, in that very looseness, larger than almost anything the mind can hold steady. There is a kind of permission in that, if you let it settle. A candle does not need to be dense to be beautiful, and a star does not need to be solid to be vast. What holds the giant together across all that hollow distance is not the tight grip of gravity alone, but a long, patient balance. Light pressing outward from within, gravity pulling inward from every direction. The two forces leaning against each other, the way two people might lean back to back, each held upright by the weight of the other rather than by any strength of their own. Loosen either side even slightly, and the whole shape shifts, breathes, swells a little further, releases a little more of itself outward into the surrounding dark. It is less a fixed object than an ongoing agreement, renewed moment by moment, patient beyond anything a human lifetime could witness in full. But this softness raises its own quiet question, one that will not let you drift past it just yet. If the outer reaches of such a star are this thin, thinner than your bedroom air, spread this wide, turning over in unhurried, star-sized currents of glow, then where, exactly, does the star actually stop? A candle's wax has an edge you could trace with a fingertip. A boulder ends where the air begins. But a giant this diffuse, this generous with its own boundary, seems to fade rather than end. Glow easing into darker glow easing into the true dark of space, with no single place where you could point and say, "Here, this is the last of the star, and beyond this, none of it remains." It is less like reaching the edge of an object, and more like walking out of a warm room into a cooling hallway, the temperature falling by degrees rather than by walls. And so, before we can call any of these hypergiants the largest thing of all, we may need to sit with a stranger possibility. That somewhere in that widening, softening glow, the whole idea of an edge begins, very quietly, to come apart. Deji/content. And because that boiling giant is mostly glow and barely wax, you can do something tonight that no telescope has ever managed to do from the outside. You can go in. Not with any effort of your own, just let the thought carry you, the way your own breath carries you towards sleep without your ever choosing each inhale. Picture yourself drifting, weightless, past the last thin scatter of interstellar dark and easing into the outer envelope of Stevenson 218, that red hypergiant so vast it makes even Betelgeuse look modest. So vast that if it sat where your small yellow sun sits, its edge would smear somewhere out past Saturn. You are not falling toward it. There is nothing here to fall toward. You are simply arriving, the way a held breath arrives at rest. The first thing you notice is that there is no first thing, no wall to meet, no membrane to pass through, no hard boundary announcing that you have crossed from empty space into star. The transition is a rumor more than an event, a gradual thickening of light, the way dusk thickens into night without a single visible seam. One moment, the space around you is merely dark with a glow far off. The next, and the next, and the next, the glow has become the whole of your surroundings, and you realize, without alarm, that you are already inside something that has no outside it can point to. You are held here, not gripped. The gas around you is thinner than the air resting in your own chest right now. Thinner than the air in the room where you are lying. Thinner than mist. Thinner than the last hush of breath before a yawn completes itself. If you reached out a hand in this place, it would pass through matter so sparse it would barely register as matter at all. And yet there is so much of it, spread across a volume so enormous that together it makes a light bright enough to be seen from the far side of a galaxy. You are floating inside a paradox that does not need solving tonight. Almost nothing, and yet almost everything you can see. There is a temptation, perhaps, to brace for weight, the way a body braces from habit even when it already knows it is lying safely on a bed. You can let that habit go now. Nothing here presses against you. Nothing here pulls at you from below. If you have ever floated on your back in warm water on the calmest kind of evening, arms loose at your sides, ears half submerged, so that the world above the surface turns to a distant hush, you already know something of this feeling. Except here there is no surface at all, above or below. Only the same easy suspension stretching outward in every direction you could think to look. Beneath you, and above you, and on every side of you at once, slow currents move. These are the convection cells your mind touched on a moment ago, each one wider than a star like the sun. Each one turning over on a schedule measured not in seconds or minutes, but in years, decades, unhurried lifetimes of its own. You feel yourself lifted by one such current, the way a leaf is lifted by a river too wide to see across. No urgency in it, no destination it is racing toward. Hot gas rises beneath you in a column too gentle to call a wind. Cooler gas sinks somewhere far off to your side, invisible, patient, completing a circuit that will take longer than your whole night's sleep to close. You do not have to swim. You do not have to steer. You are simply carried, the way a body is carried by the unhurried tide of its own breathing, in and out, asking nothing of the mind that rides along inside it. The light around you has a color and a warmth that your body already half recognizes, the way it recognizes candlelight before it recognizes anything else about a darkened room. This deep in the envelope, the gas glows at only about 3,200 degrees, searing by any measure you would use on Earth. And yet, for a star, this is among the coolest, gentlest fires there are, cooler than the white core fire of brighter stars, cooler than a welding spark, closer in its low, ember warmth to the coals left in a hearth long after the flame itself has gone quiet. It does not blind you here. It does not sting. It simply surrounds you the way lamplight through a curtain surrounds a room at the very end of evening. Amber, low, diffuse, arriving from every direction at once rather than from any single point you could turn toward. There is no glare to shield your eyes from, because there is no source you could locate. The light does not come from somewhere. The light is simply where you are. If you let your gaze soften, the way it softens in the last minute before your eyes close on their own, the amber around you seems to breathe. It brightens by some barely noticeable measure where a warmer current rises nearby, and it dims by the same small measure where a cooler current sinks away, so that the whole field of light has a pulse to it, unhurried, wide, more like the rise and fall of a sleeping chest than any flicker you would call a flame. Nothing about it startles. Nothing about it flares. It simply continues, breath after breath after breath, on a time scale so patient that 100 of your own breaths would pass, easily, within a single one of its own. Look for a floor and you will not find one. Look for a ceiling and there is none of that either. This is perhaps the strangest kindness of the place. Nothing here is asking you to stand, to hold your weight, to brace against a surface the way you brace against a mattress or a chair. There is nothing to fall from, because there is no edge close enough to name, and there is nothing to fall onto, because the glow simply continues, softening by degrees, for what would be, if you tried to measure it, a distance wider than the paths several planets trace around their own suns. You could drift here for what felt like a very long while, and nothing would change beneath you or above you except the faintest dimming, so gradual it would ask nothing of your attention at all. There is nothing to do in this place. That is worth resting on for a moment, the way you might rest your whole weight into a chair you finally trust to hold you. No task waits for you here. No decision needs making. No wall needs finding. No bottom needs reaching. No edge needs crossing before you can call yourself arrived, because in some sense you already are arrived, and have been since the moment the thought first carried you in. The great furnace hearts of ordinary stars keep a kind of restless, driving business at their centers, fusion insisting on itself moment after moment, but you are nowhere near that. You are out here in the hush of the outer envelope, where the labor of the star has already thinned into something closer to breathing, closer to drifting, closer to simply being lit rather than burning. Time behaves differently out here, or perhaps it simply stops asking to be noticed. Without a wall to measure your distance from, without a floor to mark how far you have sunk or risen, the usual small clocks your mind keeps, the ticking sense of somewhere to be, something to finish, have nothing to attach themselves to. And so, one by one, they let go. You might have been drifting a minute. You might have been drifting far longer than that. Out here, inside a light this vast and this unhurried, there is no way to tell, and no reason you would ever need to. And this is where the feeling becomes, quietly, its own kind of knowledge, a truth you do not have to be told, because your own drifting body has already found it for you. There is no wall. There is no surface. Reach in any direction you like, patiently, unhurried, and your hand will not meet resistance so much as it will meet more of the same soft glow. Thinning, 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 easing at last into the ordinary dark of space the way a whispered word eases into silence rather than stopping short of it. You came looking, without quite meaning to, for the edge of a star, the place where star ends and not star begins, and what you found instead, held gently in gas thinner than your own next breath, lit by an ember-colored warmth with no source you can point a finger toward. is that the edge was never really there to find, only the glow, and its long, slow, patient easing into dark, which is, perhaps, exactly the question worth carrying with you now, out past this drifting, amber quiet, into whatever it truly means for something so vast to have a boundary at all. And still, you are held there, drifting in that amber fog with no floor beneath you and no ceiling above, and the very absence that carries you is the answer beginning to form. You have already felt it in your body before your mind has found the words for it. There was no wall to touch, no skin of the star to press your palm against, only glow. Easing by degrees into dark, the way a thought eases into sleep without a single moment you could point to and say, "Here, this is where waking ended." That is not a failure of your senses. That is the truth of the thing itself. A star like this one does not have an edge in the way a stone has an edge, or a body has a boundary of skin. What astronomers call its surface, the photosphere, is not a surface at all. It is a depth of opacity, the layer, deep in that vast breathing atmosphere, where the star finally becomes thin enough for light to slip free and travel unhindered toward you, toward your window, toward this quiet room. Beneath that layer, light is caught and passed, and caught again, absorbed and re-emitted 1,000 times over, tangled in gas too dense to let it simply go. Above that layer, the gas grows sparse enough that a photon, once released, sails onward for years, for centuries, for the 8 patient minutes it takes sunlight to reach your own resting eyes. The photosphere, then, is not a wall. It is the place where the star stops holding its light and starts giving it away. And because that giving away depends on how thick the gas is, and gas thins out gradually rather than all at once, the boundary itself is a matter of degree, not a line drawn once and for all. Which means, tenderly, that the same star can honestly have several sizes at once. Look at it in visible light, the warm colors your eyes were built for, and you find the light escaping from one particular depth. Look at it in infrared, in the longer lower waves that pass more easily through gas and dust, and the light seems to escape from farther out, from a shell that looks larger, simply because you are measuring with a different kind of patience. Neither measurement is wrong. They are both true descriptions of a star that does not agree, even with itself, about where it stops. Look instead in radio waves, longer still, and you can trace the star's breath even farther out, into gas so thin it would have been invisible to any other instrument, and the size climbs again, honestly, without contradiction. Imagine measuring the width of a low-cloud bank by where it looks solid to your eye, versus where the mist behind it finally fades to nothing. You would get 2 honest numbers from one unbroken thing, and a third if you waited for the moonlight to show you the faintest outer wisps. That is what it is to measure a hypergiant. The candle is not lying to us. It simply never promised a single answer, and every instrument we build only teaches us a new way of asking the question. And the fuzziness runs deeper than wavelength alone, because a star this large does not end cleanly even as a body of gas. Around it lies an extended atmosphere, layers upon layers thinning outward with no crisp cutoff, and beyond that, farther out still, drifts everything the star has already breathed away. These giants shed mass constantly in slow stellar winds that carry material outward the way warmth rises from skin on a cool night, an unhurried exhalation that has been going on for thousands of years before tonight and will continue long after. Around Betelgeuse, astronomers have traced great arcs of this exhaled material, ancient breath still drifting outward, still faintly lit. Plumes rising and looping the way steam curls above a cup left too long on a windowsill. Some of that shed material eventually cools far from its source, condensing into fine dust, and it is this very dust, grains no wider than smoke, that lets these outer reaches be photographed at all, glowing faintly in infrared long after the visible starlight beneath it has thinned past following. And around Canis Majoris, one of the vastest stars ever measured, sitting near the very top of the ranking beside Stephenson 218 and UY Scuti, there hangs something even more extraordinary. Enormous shells and arcs and loops of dust flung outward across past centuries, some of it so far from the star's core that it takes light many hours, sometimes closer to a full day, simply to cross that outer material. Is that dust still the star? Or is it the star's memory, the smoke left behind by a flame that keeps forgetting to stop burning at its own edge? There is no single correct answer written anywhere in the universe. There is only the honest, low hum of a boundary that keeps dissolving the closer you look. So astronomers, when they publish a number, 1700 solar radii, or 2000, or some smaller or larger figure revised a little further with each passing year, are not reporting a fact carved in stone. They are making a choice, and admitting that they are making it. They agree, as a kind of shared courtesy, to measure to a particular depth of opacity, in a particular wavelength of light, understanding all the while that a few hundred solar radii of soft, uncertain glow lie just beyond whatever line they have drawn. It is less like measuring a mountain with a tape measure, and more like agreeing, together, on where a sunset stops being orange and starts being merely dusk. The number is real. The star behind the number is simply larger and stranger and less finished than any single number could ever hold. Even the word we reach for, hypergiant, is only a garment draped loosely over something that was never really seamed. It is a name we give for our own ease, so that a mind built to sort and file and finish things has somewhere to rest its hand. The star underneath the word does not need the word. It was glowing, boundless at its rim, long before anyone on this small blue planet had a language for radii or opacity or light hours, and it will go on glowing in that same unbothered way long after every catalog entry about it has been quietly revised again. And here is the part worth resting inside for a while, before we move on. Standing before something this unfinished, this reluctant to be pinned down, does something quiet to the part of you that likes to measure things, to know exactly where you stand. It makes you small. Not small in the frightened sense, not small the way you might feel forgotten in a crowded room, but small the way a single grain of sand feels small beside an ocean it will never need to hold up or explain. There is a kind of relief hidden inside that smallness if you let yourself find it. You do not have to know exactly where the star ends. The star does not know either, not in any way that would satisfy a ruler. And nothing bad has happened because of that. The universe simply goes on being vast and soft-edged and unbothered by the not knowing. The way you can go on breathing without ever once needing to locate the precise molecule where your inhale becomes an exhale. Some things are not made to be pinned at their border. Some things are made to be felt at a distance, glowing, understood by their warmth rather than their outline, known the way you know a person is near in a dark room before you have found the shape of their hand. There is a kindness folded into this fuzziness if you turn it over slowly enough in your mind. A star like this one asks nothing of you. It does not require you to resolve it, to finish it, to draw its outline neatly before you are allowed to rest. It simply continues, thinning outward into darkness, the way your own thoughts are already beginning to thin, the sharp edges of the evening blurring softly into whatever comes next. You do not need to know precisely where the room around you ends and the night begins either. You can simply let it all blur, the walls and the dark and the far light of that impossible candle, into one continuous, undemanding glow. And if a star that vast can be permitted to remain a little uncertain at its edges, a little unmeasured, a little unfinished, then surely you can be permitted the very same thing tonight, drifting somewhere between waking and whatever gentler place comes after it. Which brings the mind back, almost on its own, to scale, to the sheer, staggering difference in size between a grain of sand and a candle flame the width of a city, and to what that difference, held all the way up next to something so enormous and so forgiving of its own edges, might quietly give back to you. That smallness you just felt, standing at the edge of a boundary that never quite resolves, is not a loss. It is an opening. And an opening is the kind of thing a body can rest inside, so let the numbers arrange themselves one final time tonight, not to be remembered, only to be felt the way warmth is felt, without needing to be understood. Picture the earth. Round, blue, entire, every ocean you have ever swum in, every mountain, every bed anyone has ever slept in, held on this one modest sphere. Now picture it set down beside the candle flame this night has been circling. Not beside the sun, which already dwarfs it, beside the true giant, the hypergiant, the star whose light forgets its own edges. Against that flame, the earth is not a marble. It is not even a pebble. It is a single grain of sand, resting near the base of a candle the size of a city, its flame rising past rooftops, past towers, past the reach of any window you might be watching it from. And if that single grain of sand is the whole earth, then the space inside that candle, the space its light and heat and slow-turning gas actually occupy, has room enough for 1 billion such grains. 1 billion Earths drifting through the same volume, and there would still be room left over, the way a night sky still has room left over no matter how many stars you count into it. Think of it another way. If numbers are easier to hold when they borrow a body's own sense of distance, a commercial airplane, flying steadily for its whole existence, would need centuries just to trace the outer edge of that flame once, wingtip to wingtip along a curve too wide for any single flight to complete. Light itself, the fastest thing there is, the thing that reaches your eye from a lamp across a room in less time than a heartbeat, would need hours, not instants. To cross from one side of the star to the other, hours for a beam of light. And somewhere inside that unthinkable width, your entire solar system, sun and all, could be tucked near the center, with room left for the orbits that carry other worlds and still not touch the star's outer, fading edge. It is less a single object, at this point, than a slow-turning weather system of light. One so large that the word star begins to feel almost too small a word for it. Say that number slowly, if you like, though you never have to say it at all. 1 billion Earths. Set side by side, or stacked, or scattered like grains across the floor of some room too large to see the walls of, 1 billion of them would fit inside the reach of one star's light. Your whole planet, with its history and its weather and its quiet middle of the night hours, is a single mote in that flame's shadow. And ordinarily, a fact like that might be the kind of thing that presses down on the chest, the kind of scale that makes a person feel unmoored, small in the frightening sense, small the way a leaf is small in a wind it cannot argue with. But tonight, let it turn the other way. let it invert, the way a held breath finally releases into an exhale. Because something this large, something so vast it has genuinely forgotten where its own light ends, asks nothing of you. Nothing at all. It does not need you to understand its radius. It does not need you to hold its billion Earth volume in your mind at once, correctly, the way an exam might ask of you. It simply burns, unbothered, unaware, some hundreds of light years away, doing what it has always done, whether or not anyone on a small blue grain of sand happens to be listening for it in the dark. And this is the part worth lingering in, the part the whole night has been walking you toward without saying it outright. Being small, in a universe this large, does not mean being forgotten. It means being held. Think of how it feels to lie in a bed that is larger than you are, in a room that is larger than the bed, in a house that is larger than the room, in a night that stretches out over the house and the street and the whole sleeping town, larger than all of it combined, and how none of that largeness has ever once threatened you. The blanket does not need to know your name to keep you warm. The dark does not need to notice you to let you rest inside it. The universe, in exactly this way, carries its hypergiants and its grains of sand with the very same vast indifference, the same star stuff, the same physics, the same quiet permission to simply exist without being asked to justify the space you take up. A star 900 times the width of the sun does not know it is enormous. A person lying still under a blanket does not need to know their own place among a billion Earths worth of candlelight to be entitled to rest. The indifference is not coldness. It is room. It is the universe being so much larger than any single worry that your worry, too, becomes a kind of grain of sand. Real, but small enough to finally set down. There is something almost tender in that thought, if you sit with it the way you might sit with a warm cup before sleep. The same forces that inflate a dying star into a shape wide enough to swallow a billion worlds are the forces that quietly held the raw material of your own body together long before you were anyone. You are made of leftover starlight, cooled and folded into something that can lie in a bed and wonder about candle flames the size of cities. The hypergiant does not know this. It does not need to. And you do not need it to know. Tonight the relationship runs only one way, gently, from the star to you, in the form of a fact that asks for nothing back. You are being carried by the same indifference that carries suns, and there is nothing more restful than being carried by something that was never going to drop you, because it never even noticed the weight. Consider, too, how ordinary this arrangement already is, how you have practiced it every single day without calling it astronomy. A child asleep in a house does not need the house to be thinking about them in order to feel safe inside it. The walls hold their shape whether or not anyone is grateful for them. A harbor holds a boat steady through the night without once checking whether the boat noticed. This is the oldest kind of shelter there is, not attention, but sheer, patient scale, something so much bigger than you that your presence inside it barely registers as a variable at all, and is, for exactly that reason, safe. The hypergiant does not perform its vastness for an audience. It simply is that vast, unwitnessed most nights by anyone, and the fact that it does not require witnesses is precisely what makes it possible to rest beneath the idea of it. You are not being watched over. You are being outsized, in the most forgiving sense the word can carry. So let the scale settle. Let the earth stay small, a single grain near the base of a candle taller than any building you have ever stood beneath. Let the billion other Earths stay where they are, unimagined, unnecessary to picture all at once, simply available to your mind the way a whole ocean is available to a single wave. None of it is a test. None of it is homework for the body to carry into tomorrow. It is only a shape of comfort, borrowed from astronomy, offered back to you the way a story is offered back to a child who has already, without quite noticing, begun to drift. You do not need to hold the number. You only need to notice how it feels to be the smaller thing in a pairing that was never a competition to begin with. The grain that gets to lie near the base of the flame, warmed by a light too vast to ever ask anything in return. And yet a flame this size, burning at a scale that turns whole planets into sand, raises a question that has been waiting patiently this entire night, tucked just behind all the numbers. A question gentler than it sounds, and maybe the most human question of all to ask about something so enormous. How long can a candle like this actually stay lit? A flame the size of a city, a light that forgets its own edges, matter so thin it is barely there at all. Surely nothing built that way, that loosely, that generously, can burn forever. And it doesn't. What these giants do with the little time they are given is where the night turns next, towards something almost like a life, lived at a size too large for a single mind to hold, and too brief, in the end, for anything about it to feel anything other than precious. How long can a candle burn this brightly? Not long, as such things are measured. Not the 4.5 billion years your own small sun has already spent turning hydrogen into light, patiently, the way a hearth fire is fed one log at a time through a long winter. A hypergiant does not have that kind of patience to spend, because it never had that kind of fuel to begin with. Something this massive burns through its inheritance in a hurry, a few million years, start to finish, which sounds like a long time until you set it beside the age of a star, and then it becomes what it truly is, a handful of breaths in a much longer night. You can hold that thought the way you might hold a match a moment before it goes out. Brief, bright, already, in some sense, almost over. And yet nothing about that briefness feels like loss, not from here, not at this distance, not in this telling. A candle that burns fast does not fail, it simply gives its light away faster, more generously, spending itself so that something can be lit from it later. That is closer to the truth of a hypergiant's last age than any word like dying. Long before the end, the giant has already begun exhaling. Its outer layers, thin as they are, barely wax, mostly glow. As you have already felt, lift free of gravity's weak grip out there at the star's swollen edge and drift outward into space. A slow, continuous softening at the rim, the way a candle's flame relaxes and spreads as the wax beneath it warms and gives way. This is not a violent shedding. It is closer to breath fogging a cold window, an unhurried release. Matter easing off the star a little at a time, forming faint shells and veils around it, expanding outward into the dark it will eventually fall through. You have already met the evidence of this. Around Stevenson 218 and around Betelgeuse, faint and patient astronomers have found exactly this: shells of dust, loosely gathered gas, the visible residue of centuries and millennia of unhurried exhaling. And Vicanus Majoris, one of the great candles you passed earlier on the ladder, wears its own history of this shedding as a soft halo, arcs and knots of ejected material draped loosely around it like a shawl set down slowly over many lifetimes of ours. These are not violent wounds. They are the natural consequence of holding too much light for too little frame. The star swells until its own outer skin loosens, and in that loosening, a little of the star is always leaving, drifting off into the surrounding dark long before the final moment ever comes. Because a final moment does come. When a hypergiant finally exhausts what fuel remains, when its core can no longer hold the shape of the star against its own enormous weight, the ending is fast where the life was slow. A moment of collapse followed by an explosion so bright that, for a short while, it can outshine every other star in its galaxy combined. This is the supernova, and it is easy, if you let it, to hear that word and feel your shoulders tighten. You do not have to. Nothing about tonight asks you to flinch. Think of it instead the way you might think of a lantern passed from one steady hand to another at the end of a long procession. Not an ending so much as a handing over. The flame continuing on in a different shape, carried forward rather than lost. The star's material does not vanish, it scatters, and in scattering, it becomes the beginning of nearly everything that will ever be built again. Because inside that star, across those few million years, atoms had already been quietly assembled the way all stars manage it, one fusion at a time, layer folding into layer, hydrogen becoming helium becoming. In stars massive enough, all the heavier elements the universe knows how to make, carbon, oxygen, and in the outward violence of the ending itself, elements heavier still. All of this, held inside the star for millions of years, is released in the supernova and sent outward, drifting through the space between stars the way smoke drifts up through the open flue of a chimney on a cold night. Cooling, spreading, settling eventually into vast clouds. And it is from clouds exactly like this, seeded ages ago, by giants no longer here to be named, that new stars condense. And around some of those new stars, planets, oceans, and on at least one of those small round worlds made from that same drifting carbon and oxygen, made in part from calcium once forged inside the belly of some star far larger than the one now warming your own solar system, it does not need you to marvel at that fact tonight. Does not need you to hold it too tightly. It only asks to be true, in the background, the way most enormous facts are true, without insisting on your attention. There is something almost tender in the arithmetic of it. The largest stars, the ones that swell widest, that hold the most light, the ones whose surfaces would reach out past Jupiter toward Saturn if you set them where your own sun sits, these are also, in the end, the most giving. Not because they choose to be, not because a star can choose anything, but because their very size makes holding on impossible. A star this large cannot keep its light to itself for long. It is built, by its own mass, to eventually let go, to scatter its substance outward rather than hoard it, to become, eventually, the raw material for other, smaller, steadier things, for a sun like yours, for a planet like the one turning slowly beneath you right now, for a body like the one lying still under its blankets, listening. Largest, it turns out, and most generous, are very often the same word wearing two different coats. The candle that burns widest is the one that gives the most of itself away. It helps, maybe, to picture the timescale honestly, laid end to end. If your own sun's expected lifetime were stretched to fill an entire year, a hypergiant's whole existence, birth, swelling, shedding, ending, would be over before a single day had finished. It arrives already burning at a ferocious rate, because a star born with that much mass has no other way to hold itself together against its own weight. The furnace at its center must run hot and fast just to keep the star from collapsing under its own bulk. So it spends everything early, There is no long middle age for a star like this, no decades of simply being. There is only a brief, brilliant flourishing, followed by the long outward sigh of its final centuries, followed by the single sharp moment when it can no longer hold. Compared with the arithmetic of a star like your own sun, it can sound almost frantic, but sit with it a little longer, and it stops sounding frantic and starts sounding honest, a life sized to its own nature, spent at exactly the rate that nature required. And even the ending, the supernova itself, deserves a second look, because what looks from a distance like violence is, up close, mostly about distribution. The heavier elements a hypergiant forges in its final years, elements ordinary fusion in a smaller star could never reach on its own, are only made accessible to the rest of the universe, because that final collapse and rebound flings them outward, past whatever the star could have released on its own. The ending is not separate from the generosity. It is the last and largest part of it, the final unclenching of a fist that had, all along, only ever been holding material in trust. Everything scatters. Nothing is kept. And what scatters does not simply vanish. It drifts, cools, and eventually gathers, the way mist gathers back into cloud, the way cloud eventually settles as rain. Somewhere, ages later, in some fold of a galaxy, a new star begins condensing out of exactly this kind of inheritance, and around it, given enough time, planets begin to gather too. So you might picture it like this. If it helps you settle, every heavy atom in the world around you, in the frame of your bed, in the water on your nightstand, in the mineral weight of your own skeleton, once belonged to a furnace larger than anything you will ever consciously picture, and was given away long before you existed to receive it. You are, in the smallest sense, a recipient, not of anything urgent, not of any debt, just of matter, offered outward by something enormous, with no expectation of ever being thanked for it. That kind of generosity asks nothing back. It only continues, star after star, for as long as stars have existed to practice it. And so you might find yourself wondering, gently, how a creature as small as you, smaller, by any measure that matters, than a single grain against that candle's flame, ever came to know any of this at all. How does something the size of a hand, wrapped in a blanket, resting on a small rock circling a small star, come to understand the shedding and the swelling and the scattering of things so vast they hardly fit inside a single thought? It seems, on the surface, like an impossible reach. And yet the answer is not cleverness, not some sudden flash of insight arriving all at once. The answer, quietly, is patience. The same patience the stars themselves practice, just turned around and pointed outward instead of in. It took a very long time and a great many careful, unhurried people looking up into exactly this kind of dark for any of tonight's quiet facts to become known at all. And patience, it turns out, is exactly the word to rest on. Because everything you have carried with you tonight, the swollen ember-red giants, the candle too large to know its own edges, arrived to us not in a flash of understanding, but in the smallest possible increments, gathered one grain of light at a time, across generations of people who did nothing more dramatic than keep looking up. There is something tender in that. No lightning bolt of discovery, no single night when the universe simply told us how big it was. Only a long, unhurried accumulation, photon after photon, falling into open eyes and glass lenses and, eventually, into instruments patient enough to hold something as fine as a shiver of angle. It begins, this road, with a man named Friedrich Bessel, sitting in an observatory in the 1830s, watching one modest star called 61 Cygni drift by a hair's width against the fixed backdrop of farther stars as the Earth carried him around the sun. That drift, that tiny, almost embarrassed wobble, is called parallax, and it is the oldest trick we have for turning an angle too small to notice into a distance too large to picture. Hold your thumb at arm's length and close one eye, then the other, and watch your thumb hop against the wall behind it. That hop, scaled down by a factor of billions, is what Bessel caught in his glass. Night after night, through the long, cold months it took to be sure the wobble he saw was real and not some trick of temperature or tired eyes. There were false starts before him. Other astronomers who had tried and failed for 2 centuries to catch a star holding still long enough to measure, and it took Bessel's particular unhurried thoroughness, checking and rechecking a shift smaller than a fraction of a single arc second, to finally make the number trustworthy enough to publish. From that single faint hop he pulled a number, the distance to a star, and in doing so gave the sky its first real ruler. Before him, the stars were simply far. After him, they were far by a measurable amount, and every measurement of size that would follow. Everything you have heard tonight about solar radii and hypergiant girths depends somewhere back along its lineage on that first patient hop of light, caught by one man willing to watch the same faint point for years. Distance alone was not enough, though. Knowing how far away a candle stands does not, by itself, tell you how wide the flame is. For that, you need to catch the almost impossibly small angle the star's actual disk takes up in the sky, smaller by far than any parallax, smaller than anything a single lens could hope to resolve on its own, no matter how large the mirror or how dark the mountain. And so the road bends toward 2 astronomers, Albert Michelson and Francis Pease. Standing on Mount Wilson above Los Angeles in the winter of 1920, bolting a 20-foot beam of steel across the front of the great telescope there, like a pair of long, patient arms reaching out into the cold. Their instrument was an interferometer, an elegant device that does not look at a star so much as listen to the tiny interference between 2 beams of its light, caught at either end of that long beam and made to meet again, like 2 ripples on a pond crossing paths and either lifting or canceling each other, depending on the width of the source that made them. There is a particular hush to that kind of measuring. No dramatic image, no dazzling photograph, only a faint pattern of light and near dark bands shifting as the mirrors were nudged apart, fraction by fraction, until the pattern finally vanished. And in that vanishing point lay the answer. Where an ordinary telescope simply could not resolve a star's disk, this hushed trick of interference could, and pointed at Betelgeuse, that vast ember already familiar to you from earlier in the night. It returned the first measured width of a star other than the sun. A number, finally, for something that had only ever been a point of red light in the dark, a candle whose flame could now, for the first time, be said to have an actual measured breadth. From there, the road does not so much end as widen, the way a path through a garden widens into something more like a clearing. What began as a single beam bolted to one telescope has become, in our own era, networks of them working together. Instruments like the Vilti, the very large telescope interferometer, spread across a mountaintop in Chile, combining the light gathered by several separate domes into one shared, larger eye. With this kind of patient combining, astronomers have done for the great red hypergiants what Michelson once did for Betelgeuse alone. They have resolved not just a width, but something closer to a shape, mottled and uneven. the modeling itself a kind of portrait of those star-sized convection cells turning slowly beneath the surface. The same slow boil that once carried you, in your imagination, through Stevenson 218's amber fog. We are no longer catching a single faint hop of light. We are, in a soft and roundabout way, beginning to see the texture of a giant's skin. And distance itself kept being measured again, more carefully, by newer and steadier eyes. A spacecraft named Gaia has spent recent years doing what Bessel did with his hands and his patience, except from orbit, and for nearly 2 billion stars at once, watching each one make its own tiny seasonal hop against the deeper dark behind it, where older, cruder distance estimates had once placed some of the record-holding giants closer than they truly are, inflating their measured width along with their assumed nearness. Gaia's steadier parallaxes quietly pulled several of those distances back out to where they belong. Uwai Scuti, once spoken of as perhaps the largest star ever measured, saw its estimated size ease downward as its distance was gently revised, not because the star itself changed even slightly, not by a single mile, but because our ruler grew more trustworthy. This is worth resting on for a moment. The star did not shrink, only our certainty adjusted. The way a shape in fog seems to change size only because your eyes have not yet finished learning where the fog itself ends. None of this happened quickly, and none of it happened alone. Between Michelson's steel beam and the interferometers of today stretch decades of smaller advances almost too technical to name. Better mirrors, steadier mounts. Cameras cooled colder and colder to hush their own electronic murmur. Computers patient enough to combine thousands of individual exposures into one dependable average. Each generation of instrument makers inherited the last generation's careful notes and simply asked, patiently, whether the next hop of light might be caught a little more precisely than before. It is, in its own way, a kind of relay race run in extreme unhurried motion, one that has not stopped since Bessel first sat with his eye to the glass, and will not stop tonight either, while you rest. That, in the end, may be the truest thing to carry into sleep tonight, not a final number, but the shape of how numbers like this are made and remade. Every figure you heard earlier, the 1700 solar radii, the 2150, the reach toward Jupiter and beyond toward Saturn, comes wrapped in honest uncertainty. Error bars that astronomers draw not as a failure, but as a kind of integrity, an admission held out plainly rather than hidden. A loose grip, you might call it, rather than a tight fist around an answer. And there is something restful, even generous, in a science that holds its knowledge this way, gathered slowly, revised without embarrassment, offered to you with its edges left a little unresolved, much like the giant stars themselves, which never had a hard edge to measure in the first place. The measuring and the measured turn out. Quietly, to share the same nature, both are glow-easing into uncertainty. Both are honest about where their light runs out. So let the century of looking settle around you now, the way the dark settles around a window left open a crack. Somewhere, tonight, a dome on a mountain is closing its slit against the coming dawn, a slow curved roof rolling shut like an eyelid, its instruments cooling. Its mirrors resting in the dark until the next clear night calls them open again. Somewhere an interferometer's long steel arms sit still, holding no light at all for now, patient the way a held breath is patient, ready to catch the next faint interference pattern whenever a star offers one. The people who tend these instruments are, at this hour, mostly asleep themselves, or drifting toward it. Under the very stars they spent the evening measuring, Betelgeuse swollen and ember red as ever above some rooftop. Stevenson 2:18 too faint and far for any naked eye, but no less real for that. No less patiently accounted for in some database humming low on a server. Its digits softening decade by decade as the ruler improves. And you, wherever your own window opens onto that same dark garden, are simply the last and smallest link in that long, unhurried chain of looking. Someone who spent one evening letting the size of an impossible candle drift through your mind, without needing to hold on to a single digit of it, without needing the number to be final, only true enough for tonight. The astronomers will keep refining their measurements long after you have stopped listening. The stars will keep burning, indifferent to whether anyone is awake to measure them at all. And somewhere between Bessel's first faint hop of light and Gaia's faint revisions, between a beam of steel on a mountain in 1920 and whatever patient eye is open tonight, the true size of the largest candle in the sky is even now gently being written down. Tonight has been about a small flame you already know, the one that rises every morning without ever needing your attention, and about letting that familiar warmth become the doorway into something far larger than itself. Tonight has been about climbing, rung by unhurried rung, up a ladder of giants, past star after star that dwarfed the one before it, until the numbers stopped meaning anything at all, and all that remained was a feeling of scale, wide and patient, settling low into your chest. Tonight has been about drifting into the soft edge of the very largest of them, a star so vast and so thin at its outer reaches that it no longer knows exactly where it ends, its light fading into the dark the same way your thoughts are fading now, without a clear line between one and the next. Tonight has been about the patient watchers, the long, unbroken chain of people who looked up, measured what little they could, waited decades for better instruments, and slowly assembled a picture that none of them would ever live to see finished. And none of that effort needs a single thing from you tonight. You do not have to remember the ladder, or the order of the giants, or which star came before which. None of it was ever a test. None of it was ever going to be. You were only here to listen, and to let the listening loosen whatever had been holding you a little too tightly to the day behind you. Another quiet exploration is already waiting just past this one, queued up on the screen in front of you, ready to begin entirely on its own the moment this one ends. You do not need to reach for anything. You do not need to choose, or decide, or even open your eyes. Let it start by itself, low and unhurried, the way tonight began, and let yourself drift from this one into the next without ever quite noticing the moment you crossed over. Before you go, here is one small, useless question, offered only to loosen into, nothing to solve and nothing to answer out loud. If a star can grow so large that it forgets its own edge, what edge of your own day might you let yourself stop tracing so carefully, just for tonight, not solving it, only letting the question drift by once, like something glimpsed from a train window and then gone? Your breathing has probably slowed already, on its own, the way it always does once nothing more is being asked of it. The room around you is exactly as far away as it needs to be, and no farther. Whatever thoughts are still moving are moving faintly now, thin and unhurried, like starlight that left its source so long ago that the star itself may have already changed, may have already swelled or dimmed or shifted into something else entirely, with the light itself still unaware. You do not have to know either. You do not have to finish this thought, or any thought. Let your eyelids rest their full weight down. Let your breathing find its own low rhythm without any help from you. Let the last of tonight's pictures, a candle taller than reason can hold, a ladder without a final rung, an edge that keeps almost arriving and never quite does, settle somewhere behind your closed eyes and simply stay there, undisturbed, needing nothing further from you. There is nowhere else you need to be right now. There is nothing left to hold and nothing left to carry. Just this dark, this weight, this easy hush, carrying you the rest of the way on its own. Sleep well.